They called the cook a liar until the menu card revealed what happened at sea. Eliza Merrin was crouched behind the flour barrels in the cold pantry of the steam yacht Althea when the foghorn sounded for the third time. The sound rolled through the hull like a warning from something old and blind. Above her, silver trays trembled on their hooks. Below her knees, the floor shivered with the steady pulse of the engine, though Captain Ames had ordered half speed an hour ago. The yacht was somewhere off the Rhode Island coast, close enough to land for a church bell to be imagined, too far from help for a woman's cry to matter. Eliza held 3 cream-colored menu cards against her apron. On the first, printed in blue ink, was the dinner Mrs. Augusta Vale had ordered for that evening. Oysters and cream, roast duck, lemon ice, coffee. On the back, in Eliza's small kitchen hand, were the words she had written while her fingers still smelled of parsley. Mr. Calder never takes oysters. Doctor's order, Mrs. Vale insisted. On the second card, written over a stain of beef tea, was another note. Julian Price said, "After Point Judith, fog will do the rest." On the third card, the ink had blurred where Eliza's damp thumb pressed too hard. Blue medicine bottle missing. Night cordial changed. Ask Captain before supper. She had meant to ask him. She had meant to go straight to Henry Calder and lay the cards before him, even if every person aboard called her impertinent, hysterical, or worse. But when she returned to the galley, the narrow knife used for carving cold ham was gone from its hook, and a smear of amber medicine glistened on the silver spoon beside Mr. Calder's glass. Then she had heard steps in the passage. Slow steps. Careful steps. The kind made by someone trying not to wake the boards. Now the pantry latch lifted. Eliza pressed the menu cards flat against her apron and stopped breathing. The door opened just wide enough for fog-colored light to cut the dark. A hand appeared around the edge, gloved in black. In that hand was the missing carving knife. 5 days earlier, Eliza had been standing in Mrs. Bell's domestic office in Providence with rainwater soaking the hem of her skirt and 12 cents in her purse. The office smelled of ink, damp wool, and disappointment. Girls came there for positions when they had no aunt to speak for them and no family name worth writing on a calling card. Some left for respectable kitchens. Some left for houses where the mistress counted spoons after every meal. A few did not leave at all, but returned week after week, each time with less hope folded into their gloves. Eliza was 28 and already knew the geography of service better than most maps. She had cooked in a doctor's house, a boarding house, and one summer hotel where rich guests complained of fish while fishermen's wives waited outside with empty baskets. She had a straight back, red-brown hair she pinned severely under a cap, and hands marked by burns so old they had become part of her skin. She also had a brother named Samuel, 17 years old, apprenticed to an apothecary in Boston, clever enough to read Latin labels and poor enough to eat yesterday's bread without complaint. Their parents were gone. Their mother had died in childbirth when Samuel was 3. Their father had gone down with a fishing boat off Block Island during a November gale that people in town still spoke of when the wind turned sharp. Since then, Eliza had counted wages the way other women counted prayers. Mrs. Bell, who ran the office with a widow's efficiency and a soldier's suspicion, looked over her spectacles and said there was a position for 1 week only, a private yacht out of Newport. The name alone put a different air into the room. Newport meant marble houses, lace curtains, lawns clipped like velvet, and women who changed gowns more often in a day than Eliza changed aprons in a week. It meant old families with new money beside them, each pretending not to need the other. It meant wages paid promptly if one survived the manners. Mrs. Bell said the cook originally engaged had taken ill. The family required a woman who could manage soup, cold suppers, invalid broths, simple pastry, and a formal dinner if called upon. No drinking, no followers, no seasickness, if possible. Departure the next morning from Newport Harbor. Pay generous. Eliza asked, how generous? Mrs. Bell named a sum large enough to pay Samuel's next quarter with the apothecary and settle the grocer's bill that had followed Eliza from one lodging to another like a small, patient ghost. Eliza said she could leave in the morning. Mrs. Bell gave her a look that had measured hundreds of women. She said the Calder party was not an easy one. Henry Calder owned mills, docks, and shares in shipping lines. He was not old Newport, though he had married into it. His late wife, Madeleine Vale, had died 4 years earlier under circumstances people still lowered their voices to discuss. Some said heart trouble, some said nerves. Some said a lady who married new money learned too late that gold could not polish sorrow. Mrs. Augusta Vale, Madeleine's mother, still lived under Mr. Calder's roof and ruled his daughter's upbringing as if widowhood had made her queen of all grief. There would also be Mr. Julian Price, a cousin of the Vales and advisor to several family trusts. Handsome, Mrs. Bell said, which was not always a recommendation. A young daughter, Beatrice, a companion. 2 gentlemen guests joining later, a captain and crew. A week at sea, up the coast and back, with calls near Watch Hill and Martha's Vineyard if the weather allowed. Eliza listened, taking in only what mattered for work. Allergies, temperaments, invalids, meal hours, the yacht's stores, the number of servants. Mrs. Bell added that Mr. Calder never took shellfish, not an allergy exactly, but close enough to danger. His doctor had forbidden oysters and rich cream after an illness of the heart the previous winter. Mrs. Vale disliked mentioning illness at table. The cook must remember without being reminded. Eliza wrote that down on the back of an old envelope. Mrs. Bell watched her write and said girls with notes sometimes lasted longer than girls with smiles. Eliza had no smile to spare, so the remark suited her. She left Providence before dawn on the milk train, carrying 1 carpet bag, her knives wrapped in cloth, and her mother's small sewing kit. Samuel came to the station with her and pretended he had only stopped by on the way to the apothecary. He had ink on his cuff and worry on his face. He told her rich people's houses were worse than storms, because storms did not pretend to be kind. Eliza gave him the stern look she used when he was 12 and trying to skip school, then pressed 2 coins into his hand for breakfast. He tried to refuse. She told him apothecaries who fainted from hunger did not inspire confidence. He grinned then, and for a moment she saw the boy he had been before debt and study sharpened him. On the train, Eliza watched mill towns slide past, then farms, then the glimpses of water that came brighter and colder as the line neared Newport. She had worked near the sea most of her life, but had never traveled on a private yacht. Boats were work where she came from, not drawing rooms with engines. Men sailed them to earn bread and sometimes did not return. The idea that people boarded one for pleasure seemed to her a sign that money could make human beings foolish with danger. The Althea lay in Newport Harbor like a white thought no one had dared dirty. Her hull shone. Brass fittings caught the morning sun. A narrow funnel rose above polished decks. The name was painted in dark blue letters near the stern. Men moved about her with the quiet precision of a crew that understood wealthy passengers preferred labor to be invisible until something went wrong. Captain Elias Ames met Eliza at the gangway. He was a compact man with a weathered face, gray beard, and eyes that missed little. He looked at her bag, her wrapped knives, her sturdy shoes, and the way she held the rail before stepping aboard. He asked whether she had cooked at sea. Eliza said she had cooked where floors moved, though mostly from bad foundations and not waves. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. He showed her the galley himself. The galley was smaller than the kitchens Eliza knew, but better arranged. Copper pans hung from hooks. The stove was fixed in iron. A narrow cold pantry held flour, butter, eggs, preserved fruit, smoked fish, ham, and crates of lemons. There was a dumbwaiter to the saloon and a speaking tube to the steward's passage. Everything had a latch. Everything had a place. Eliza liked that at once. The stewardess, Mary Klein, was a square-faced woman with capable arms and a manner that made room for no nonsense. She had served aboard the Althea for 2 seasons and said the first rule was never to leave knives unsecured. The second was never to believe passengers knew what weather meant. And the third was to keep clear of Mrs. Vale unless summoned. Eliza asked whether Mrs. Vale summoned often. Mary said only when she wished someone smaller than herself to feel the size of the world. By noon, the passengers began to arrive. Henry Calder came first, though no one announced him as if he needed announcing. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered but worn down at the edges, with dark hair touched by gray and eyes that looked as if they had been trained to endure rooms where people wanted things from him. He paused at the galley door, not entering without permission, and thanked Eliza for taking the position on short notice. It was a small courtesy. It landed oddly. Most employers thanked agencies, not cooks. He asked if Mrs. Bell had told her about the doctor's restrictions. Eliza said yes. No shellfish, little cream, no heavy sauces, coffee moderate, broth preferred if his strength failed. He seemed relieved that she spoke of it plainly. He said Mrs. Vale considered doctors vulgar at table. Eliza answered that doctors were often vulgar only after patients had ignored them. The words escaped before she weighed them. In another house, such a remark might have cost her the position. Mr. Calder looked at her, then laughed softly, not because she was ridiculous, but because the truth had surprised him. He said he would trust her more than the table, then. That was the first time Eliza felt the danger of being seen. Not romance, not foolishness. Something more troubling. A person accustomed to invisibility learns to use it as a cloak. Mr. Calder's attention lifted the edge. Mrs. Augusta Vale arrived in a black carriage with 2 trunks, 1 maid, and a face that made the harbor seem informal. She was a tall woman in her 60s, dressed in grey silk despite the summer warmth. Her hair was white, arranged with severe elegance beneath a traveling hat. She carried a silver-handled cane she did not seem to need, except as punctuation. She paused on the deck, looked over the crew, and accepted Captain Ames's greeting as if he were a weather condition that had behaved properly. When she saw Eliza, she asked Mary whether the cook was clean, sober, and silent. Eliza stood close enough to hear. Mary said the cook was present. Mrs. Vale's eyes moved over Eliza's plain dress, work-worn hands, and travel bag. She said presence was not always a virtue. Then she passed into the saloon. The daughter came last. Beatrice Calder was 12, thin, fair, and too composed for a child. She wore a sailor dress of fine white cotton and held a music case against her chest as if it contained a living thing. She looked at the yacht without pleasure. When Henry bent to kiss her forehead, she allowed it, and then glanced toward Mrs. Vale as though seeking permission to feel. Eliza saw that look and knew something of the child's life without being told. Children in grand houses were often dressed in ribbons and raised by absence. Adults argued over what they represented: blood, inheritance, memory, a dead mother's face, a father's future. What the child wanted for supper was usually considered less important. At 4 o'clock, the Althea left Newport Harbor. The great houses on shore receded into pale shapes. The water brightened. Wind lifted the edges of the deck awnings. Eliza worked below, steadying herself when the floor shifted, counting eggs, sorting greens, checking the ice chest, learning the stove's temper. From above came the murmur of voices, and now and then Beatrice's piano exercises played too precisely on the little upright in the saloon. At dinner that first evening, Eliza sent up clear chicken broth for Mr. Calder, baked sole for the table, potatoes with parsley, asparagus, and a sponge cake filled with lemon cream for everyone but him. For Mr. Calder, she prepared stewed peaches and a dry biscuit. She expected complaint. Rich men often disliked being denied what others enjoyed, even by doctors. Instead, after dinner, the dumbwaiter returned with his plate empty and one of the printed menu cards folded beside it. On the back, in a clear, masculine hand, he had written, "Excellent. Thank you for remembering what others forget." Eliza read the line twice, then placed the card in the pocket of her apron. Menu cards aboard the Althea were printed each day by a small press kept for Mr. Calder's amusements and announcements. The steward, Mr. Pike, set them at each place because Mrs. Vale believed a dinner without printed courses belonged to hotels of the second class. The cards were cream stock with a blue border of small sea flowers. Eliza thought them wasteful, then useful. The blank backs were just the size for notes. That night, after the galley was cleaned and the passengers had gone to their cabins, she wrote on the back of the card, "Day 1. Mr. Calder, kind. Mrs. Vale, cold. Child watches her grandmother before speaking." She did not know why she wrote it. Perhaps habit. Perhaps because aboard a yacht, like in a rich house, a servant's memory was expected to vanish at the end of each day. Eliza had never liked vanishing. The second day was fair and sharp with wind. The Althea steamed eastward, stopping briefly near Watch Hill to take on 2 guests, Mr. Julian Price and Miss Cora Blanchard, a young widow related to the Vales by one of those connections that rich families trace when useful and forget when not. Miss Blanchard was pretty, restless, and fond of looking unhappy in flattering light. Mr. Price was handsome in a way that seemed practiced before mirrors. Smooth, dark hair, careful mustache, easy voice, white hands. He entered the saloon carrying flowers for Mrs. Vale and a parcel of illustrated papers for Beatrice. He kissed Mrs. Vale's hand and spoke of Madeleine within 10 minutes of arriving, softly enough to appear sensitive, loudly enough to ensure Henry heard. Eliza, carrying coffee through the passage, saw Henry's face close. Madeleine Vale Calder had been dead 4 years, but she was still aboard the Althea. Her portrait hung in the saloon, a pale woman with light eyes, a long neck, and a faintly uncertain mouth. Fresh flowers had been placed beneath it. Beatrice never looked directly at the portrait. Mrs. Vale looked at it often, but always with acclaim rather than grief, as if death had returned her daughter to her custody. During luncheon, Mr. Price praised Eliza's cold chicken and asked with theatrical friendliness whether the cook had come from Boston or from some humbler shore. Mary later said it was his way of making insult sound like conversation. Eliza answered from the service doorway that she came from wherever the work was honest. Mr. Price laughed. Mrs. Vale did not. After luncheon, Eliza went to the pantry for preserves and heard voices beyond the bulkhead near the companionway. On land, houses carry sound through vents and halls. At sea, a yacht carries it through wood, pipe, and steel, so that secrets travel like steam. Mr. Price said Henry was stronger than expected. Mrs. Vale answered that strength had never been Henry's virtue. Endurance was a poorer thing. Mr. Price said endurance could still interfere. There was a pause. Eliza held the jar of cherries and listened despite herself. Then he said that after Point Judith, fog was forecast. Fog made even careful men misstep. The deck at night, the old weakness of the heart, a little confusion from medicine, and grief would explain everything. People had accepted less before. Mrs. Vale said sharply that Beatrice must never know. Mr. Price replied that Beatrice would know only what her elders allowed her to know, as she had known after Madeleine. Eliza's hand tightened around the jar. The glass slipped slightly against her palm. She caught it before it struck the shelf. The voices stopped. She stepped back, heart pounding, and returned to the galley with the preserves still unopened. That afternoon, she wrote on the back of a menu card, Julian and Mrs. Vale, Point Judith, fog, misstep, medicine. As after Madeleine. She tucked the card deep into the hem pocket of her apron, a place she had sewn herself for coins and train tickets. Then she made tea, as if her body had not become a bell ringing under her skin. The obvious thing would have been to tell Captain Ames, but obvious things are often less clear to a woman in service. Servants heard scraps all the time. Servants misunderstood, according to those who wanted them silent. Servants who accused guests were dismissed before the truth could put on its shoes. Eliza had Samuel's apprenticeship to pay. She also had the memory of her father lost at sea and the way officials told her mother that storms were storms and men who worked boats knew the risks. Still, by evening she had decided to speak to someone. She chose Henry Calder because he had thanked her like a human being. That was not proof of wisdom, but it was a beginning. Before she could find him alone, Mrs. Vale sent for her. The summons came through Mary. The cook was to present herself in the saloon after tea. Eliza washed her hands, changed her apron, and went up. The saloon was furnished like a parlor that had forgotten it floated. Blue upholstered chairs, brass lamps, a small piano, Madeleine's portrait above the writing desk. Beatrice sat near the window with embroidery she was not doing. Henry stood by the chart table. Mr. Price lounged with one hand on the mantel rail. Mrs. Vale sat beneath her daughter's portrait, as if holding court before a ghost. On the table lay the menu card from dinner the night before, the one Henry had written on. Eliza knew it before she saw the back. Mrs. Vale asked whether Eliza made a habit of collecting gentlemen's notes. The room went still. Henry looked confused, then angry. He said he had written a compliment to the cook. Mrs. Vale said compliments to servants had a way of encouraging fantasies, and fantasies at sea could become troublesome. She did not accuse Eliza directly. She did worse. She made implication do the work, so everyone present could remain polite while shame entered the room. Eliza felt heat rise in her face. Mr. Price watched with mild amusement. Mrs. Vale said a woman in Eliza's position should be careful not to mistake courtesy for intimacy. Henry said that was enough. Mrs. Vale said she had buried one daughter after foolish misjudgments aboard this yacht and would not stand by while another household was made ridiculous. Beatrice flinched at buried. Eliza saw it. Henry saw it too. He told Eliza she might return to the galley and that no fault attached to her. He said it firmly, but the damage had been done. Mrs. Vale had placed Eliza in the story she wanted. A working woman with ambitions, a man too kind, a family needing protection from vulgar misunderstanding. Back below, Mary found Eliza cutting carrots with unnecessary force. Mary said Mrs. Vale's grief had teeth. Eliza asked whether grief explained everything. Mary did not answer at once. Then she said Madeleine had died during a summer cruise on the Althea, though not at sea exactly. They had anchored near a cove. There had been a small shore party, a storm coming in, confusion. Madeleine was found at the foot of wet rocks after leaving the yacht alone. The family said her heart failed, or her nerves failed. Mary had not been aboard then. Captain Ames had. So had Julian Price. So had Mrs. Vale. Eliza asked what Henry said. Mary said Henry had been half dead with fever in his own cabin that night. He remembered little after taking his medicine. Medicine. Eliza wrote another note. Madeleine died after Henry took medicine. Julian there, Mrs. Vale there. Captain knows? The third day dawned with a flat sky and water like dull metal. Eliza slept poorly and rose before the steward's boy lit the galley lamp. She prepared toast, eggs, coffee, and a mild broth for Henry. When Mary carried the tray up, she returned with a frown. Mr. Price had intercepted it, saying Henry would breakfast later and had requested chocolate instead. Eliza knew at once that Henry had requested no such thing. She made the chocolate herself, thin and plain, and sent no cream. Then she went up with a covered dish under the excuse of replacing cold toast. Henry was in the small deck cabin writing letters. He looked up, surprised but not annoyed. Eliza asked in a low voice whether he had requested chocolate. He said no. The quiet between them sharpened. She told him then, not everything, but enough. The overheard words near the pantry, the mention of fog and medicine, the odd reference to Madeleine, the changed breakfast. She expected disbelief. She expected anger at impertinence. She expected dismissal wrapped in kindness. Henry did none of these things. He sat very still, and the color left his face in a way that had nothing to do with weakness of the heart. He asked her to repeat the exact words. Eliza did. She had written them down. She took the menu card from her apron and laid it on the desk. Henry read it once, then again. He said Julian Price had managed parts of Madeleine's family trust for years. He said Augusta hated him enough to wish him unhappy, perhaps ruined, but he could not believe she would wish him dead. He said Julian had been kind after Madeleine's death. He said many things men say when betrayal approaches wearing a familiar face. Eliza listened. Then she said, familiar faces were useful when entering rooms where strangers would be stopped. Henry looked at her. He asked why she was helping him. She might have said because he paid her wages. She might have said because murder was wrong. She might have said because her father had died where water took the blame for human carelessness. All were true. What she said was that she had seen Beatrice listening. That reached him. Henry folded the menu card and returned it to her. He asked her to keep watching, but to put herself in no danger. It was the sort of instruction a gentleman gives when danger has already chosen the person least protected. Eliza did not argue. She only asked whether there was medicine he took at night. He showed her a small blue bottle kept in a locked drawer. Digitalis drops, prescribed by a Boston physician after his illness. Strong, he said, and not to be taken except in measured dose. He wore the key on his watch chain. Eliza noticed the bottle was nearly half full. She also noticed the key ring held a second, smaller key. Henry said it opened Madeleine's old traveling case, which remained aboard because Mrs. Vale refused to have it moved from the yacht. It held shawls, music, small things no one knew how to throw away. Eliza did not yet understand why that mattered. By noon, the yacht was in rougher water. Miss Cora Blanchard took to her cabin with smelling salts. Beatrice grew pale, but insisted she was not ill. Mrs. Vale stayed in the saloon writing letters with a hand steady enough to be a rebuke to weather. Mr. Price played patience with himself and lost gracefully. Henry remained on deck longer than Captain Ames liked. Eliza worked below and watched. At luncheon, Mr. Price asked for oysters to be added to the evening menu. He said Mrs. Vale had long promised him the Althea's oyster stew, and what was a coastal cruise without oysters? Mary carried the request down. Eliza refused. Mary said refusal would travel upward badly. Eliza said so would a dead employer. An hour later, Mrs. Vale came to the galley. Even Mary seemed surprised. Ladies did not enter the galley unless the ship was sinking or their authority required a smaller room. Mrs. Vale stood just inside the door, one gloved hand resting on her cane. She said Mr. Calder's restrictions had been exaggerated. He had taken oysters for years before cooks began reading doctors like scripture. The dinner would proceed as printed. Eliza said Mr. Calder himself had confirmed the restriction. Mrs. Vale's eyes hardened. She said Eliza had a troubling habit of seeking conversation with Mr. Calder. Mary went very still. Eliza understood the trap. If she obeyed, Henry might be harmed. If she refused, Mrs. Vale could accuse her of insubordination already colored by impropriety. A servant's reputation had no thick walls. One whisper could pass through it like rain through paper. Eliza said she would prepare oyster stew for those permitted to eat it, and a separate clear soup for Mr. Calder, marked plainly. Mrs. Vale said that would embarrass him. Eliza said illness was less embarrassing than burial. The words struck the galley like a dropped pan. Mrs. Vale lifted her cane a fraction, not to strike, but as if she wished the gesture belonged to another age when women of her station did not need arguments. She said Eliza would regret insolence. Eliza said she had regretted silence more often. Mrs. Vale left. Mary exhaled and said Eliza had either saved a man or lost a position before supper. Eliza answered that the two were not mutually exclusive. That evening, the table received oyster stew in delicate cups. Henry received clear chicken soup in a covered bowl. Mr. Price noticed. He smiled without warmth and asked whether the cook feared rebellion from shellfish. Henry replied that the cook valued his doctor's bill more than his vanity. Mrs. Vale said nothing through the course, but later, when the dishes returned, Eliza found Henry's soup bowl nearly full. On the tray beside it lay the silver spoon. It smelled faintly bitter, medicinal, not of chicken. Eliza set it aside. She did not wash it. The fourth day brought fog. It began as a veil at dawn and thickened by mid-morning until the world beyond the rail disappeared. The yacht seemed to move inside a closed, white room. Sound changed. Footsteps came nearer before bodies appeared. Voices lost direction. The foghorn spoke at intervals, patient and mournful. Captain Ames disliked the weather and made no attempt to hide it. He reduced speed and posted extra watch. Mr. Price, by contrast, seemed livelier. He walked the saloon. He spoke of ghost ships and romantic dangers until Beatrice left the room. Eliza found the girl near the galley stairs sitting with her music case unopened. Beatrice asked whether cooks were ever afraid at sea. Eliza said sensible cooks were afraid of knives left loose, spoiled cream, and gentlemen who thought fog was pretty. The child almost smiled. Then she asked whether her mother had been afraid. Eliza could have said she did not know. It would have been true. Instead, she sat on the lower step, keeping enough distance for propriety and enough closeness for kindness. She said fear did not mean a person lacked courage. Sometimes fear meant a person knew something was wrong before others were ready to see it. Beatrice looked at her sharply. She said grandmother told her that her mother had been too delicate for this world. Eliza said people often called women delicate when they had not listened to what made them desperate. The child's eyes filled and emptied again without tears falling. She said she had a box of her mother's things. Grandmother kept it locked, but Beatrice knew where the key was because adults always thought children noticed only toys. Eliza said nothing. The foghorn sounded. Beatrice whispered that her mother had once hidden notes in silly places: music, glove fingers, menu cards, even the back of a painted fan. She did it because Mrs. Vale said writing letters in anger was vulgar, so Madeleine wrote and did not send. Menu cards. Eliza felt the word settle. Before she could ask more, Mr. Price appeared at the top of the passage. He greeted Beatrice too brightly and said Mrs. Vale wanted her in the saloon. His eyes moved from the child to Eliza on the step. He said the cook seemed to have many conversations outside her station. Eliza rose and said steps were between stations by nature. He laughed softly, but his eyes did not. That afternoon, Henry's blue medicine bottle disappeared. He discovered it himself after rest hour. The drawer was locked. The key was still on his chain, yet the bottle inside was gone, replaced by another blue bottle of nearly the same shape, filled to the same level. Henry might not have noticed if Eliza had not asked him earlier how full the original had been. The label on the new bottle was slightly crooked. The liquid smelled sweeter. Henry sent for Captain Ames quietly. The captain examined the lock and found no obvious damage. He said there were ways to open a small drawer if one had patience and a wire. He also said Henry must not take a drop from the new bottle until they reached port and a doctor examined it. Henry wanted to confront Julian immediately. Eliza advised against it. The advice surprised everyone, herself included, but she had spent years in kitchens where accusation too early allowed guilty people to clean their hands. She said they needed to know who carried the original bottle and what was planned for the evening. Captain Ames asked whether she had proof beyond suspicion. Eliza showed him the menu cards. He read them under the cabin lamp, his jaw tight. At the words, "as after Madeleine," he closed his eyes. Henry saw that and asked what he knew. Captain Ames took longer than comfort allowed before answering. He said the night Madeleine died had never sat right with him. She had been agitated at dinner, then calm in a way he did not trust. Henry had been ill in his cabin after taking medicine. Mrs. Vale said her daughter needed air. Mr. Price escorted Madeleine to the launch steps. Later, Madeleine was found ashore below wet rocks after a squall. There was talk of a misstep. There was talk of nerves. Captain Ames wanted an inquiry. Mrs. Vale insisted scandal would destroy Beatrice. Henry, fevered and grieving, had no strength to fight the Vale family version. Henry listened like a man hearing the shape of a grave change. The captain said he had regretted silence every season since. Eliza thought of her own words to Mrs. Vale and said nothing. They agreed on a plan. Henry would appear to take his medicine at supper but would not swallow it. Captain Ames would keep 2 deckhands near the aft passage. Eliza would control what went from galley to table. Mary would watch Beatrice. No one would leave the saloon alone after dark. Plans comfort people because they make danger look like something with edges. Danger aboard the Althea had no edges. It moved through fog, polished wood, family grief, and servants' corridors. It knew which doors were locked and which women would not be believed. Before supper, Eliza went to the cold pantry for lemons and found her apron missing from its hook. Not the clean apron she wore, the working apron with the hem pocket. The menu cards were inside. Her first thought was not fear, but fury. She had been careful. She had trusted the galley because kitchens were the one place she usually knew how to defend. Now even that small territory had been entered. She searched the galley, pantry, laundry cupboard, and passage hooks. Nothing. Mary swore under her breath and said she had seen Miss Cora near the lower companionway earlier, complaining of the smell of onions. Miss Cora had no reason to touch an apron unless someone asked her to distract attention. Eliza went cold. Without the cards, she had memory but not record. Worse, the cards might be altered, planted, used against her as Henry's compliment had been. She imagined Mrs. Vale holding them before the passengers, the cook writing fantasies about Mr. Calder, inventing danger, prying into family sorrow. She imagined Samuel hearing that his sister lost her place for improper conduct. Then she remembered Beatrice. The child had said Madeleine hid notes in menu cards, fans, music. Eliza could not save her own cards yet, but perhaps there were older ones. She went to the passage outside Mrs. Vale's cabin and found Beatrice there, pale as fog, holding a key so small it might have belonged to a music box. Beatrice said grandmother was asleep and Mr. Price had gone to the smoking room. She said her mother's traveling case was in the linen cupboard by the aft stairs. She said she did not know why she was telling Eliza except that the yacht felt the way a room feels before someone breaks a lamp. Eliza knelt before her. She told Beatrice that if they opened the case, some truths might be painful. Beatrice answered that lies had not been gentle. The traveling case was made of dark leather, cracked at the corners, with Madeleine Calder's initials stamped in gold. It smelled of lavender, dust, and the faint salt damp that enters everything kept aboard a vessel. Eliza and Beatrice carried it into the stewardess's linen room. Mary stood guard in the passage. Inside were shawls wrapped in tissue, a pair of white gloves, sheet music, a fan painted with blue flowers, a small prayer book, and a bundle of old menu cards tied with a ribbon faded almost gray. Beatrice touched the ribbon as if it were skin. The top card was from a dinner 4 years earlier aboard the Althea. Cream stock, blue sea flowers. The courses were richer than the present menus: terrapin, oysters, roast quail, iced pudding, coffee. On the back was a line in a nervous, slanting hand. Henry is ill again after the drops. Julian says it is nerves, but Henry never takes enough to be so lost. Eliza unfolded the next card. Julian has asked Mother not to speak of the trust papers. He says scandal will ruin B. He always says B when he wants Mother afraid. The third. If I am found careless, ask why the blue bottle changed. Beatrice made a small sound. Eliza wanted to stop. The child was 12. There should have been someone else to hold this grief for her. But the adults who should have protected her had built a house of silence around it. And now, silence had become dangerous again. The fourth card was tucked inside the painted fan. It had been folded so tightly the paper nearly cracked. Mother did not know at first. I think she knows now. She is afraid of the name more than the sin. Tell Henry I did not leave him. Tell B I was trying to come back. For a while, there was only the foghorn and Beatrice's uneven breathing. Eliza put the cards back in order. She did not know the law, but she knew witness when she saw it. Madeleine had seen the same pattern. Medicine changed, trust papers hidden, Mrs. Vale frightened into silence by the threat of scandal, Julian at the center. The dead woman had not been merely delicate. She had been trying to write herself out of a lie before the lie killed her. Mary entered then, face grim. She said Eliza was wanted in the saloon at once. When Eliza arrived, the passengers had gathered under the lamps. Outside the windows, fog pressed white against black glass. Henry stood by the mantel, too pale but steady. Captain Ames stood near the door. Mr. Price held Eliza's missing apron in one hand. Mrs. Vale sat rigid in her chair. On the table lay the 3 menu cards Eliza had written. Mr. Price said he regretted the embarrassment, but troubling evidence had been found among the cook's things. Notes about Mr. Calder, his medicine, Mrs. Vale, and the death of Mrs. Calder. He said fascination could become dangerous in women unused to gentle treatment. He said perhaps Eliza had meant only to dramatize herself, but Mr. Calder's safety required that she be confined until they reached port. Miss Cora looked away. Henry said Eliza had written those notes because she was asked to watch. Mr. Price raised his brows. He said that was gallant, but gallantry had led men into foolish explanations before. Mrs. Vale asked Henry whether he truly intended to defend a cook against his own family. The word cook carried the whole weight of her world. Eliza stood at the saloon doorway and felt every eye on her. The room smelled of lamp oil, wet wool, and roses beginning to decay beneath Madeleine's portrait. Her apron, held in Mr. Price's clean hand, looked like a poor woman's flag captured in battle. She could have shouted. She wanted to. She wanted to tell them that rich people mistook quiet for emptiness, service for blindness, poverty for moral weakness. But anger alone would help Julian. It would make her exactly the woman he described, emotional, overreaching, unsteady. She looked at Beatrice, standing half-hidden behind Mary in the passage. Then Eliza took the old menu cards from her bodice, where she had tucked them for safety, and laid them beside her own. She said the habit of writing on menu cards was not hers first. No one moved. Henry stepped closer and saw Madeleine's hand. He reached for the cards, then stopped as if touching them too quickly might make them vanish. Mrs. Vale rose. Her face had gone gray. She asked where those had been found. Eliza said in Madeleine's traveling case, with Beatrice's permission. Mrs. Vale turned toward the child. For a moment, outrage rose in her. Then Beatrice stepped forward and said her mother had written that she was trying to come back. The words broke something no accusation could have broken. Mrs. Vale lowered herself into the chair. Henry read the cards in silence. When he reached the last one, his hand shook so violently that Captain Ames took the paper before it tore. Mr. Price began to speak. Captain Ames interrupted him. The captain said the blue bottle in Mr. Calder's drawer had been replaced that afternoon. He had the false bottle locked in his own cabin. He also had the silver spoon from dinner, saved by Eliza before it could be washed. He had sent a signal to the nearest station through a passing fishing smack before the fog thickened, requesting a harbor officer meet them at first safe anchorage. It was not the law yet, but it was enough to make the saloon feel smaller around Mr. Price. Julian Price looked at Eliza with something like hatred finally stripped of polish. He said servants had active imaginations. Mrs. Vale spoke then. At first, her voice was barely audible. She said Madeleine had come to her before she died, frightened about papers Julian managed and Henry's medicine. Augusta had dismissed it as strain. She had believed Julian when he said Madeleine's nerves were failing. She had believed him because believing him preserved the shape of the world she understood. Henry as the outsider who had made her daughter unhappy, Julian as family, the Vale name as a thing to be protected from ugly public questions. After Madeleine died, Augusta found one note. Not these cards. A smaller note, half destroyed by damp, asking her to look at the blue bottle. She did not look. Or rather, she looked and then chose not to understand. She told herself grief made patterns where none existed. She told herself Beatrice needed a grandmother with a spotless name more than a scandal that could not raise the dead. Her eyes moved to Eliza. She said she had learned to silence women by calling them delicate, vulgar, ambitious, or unwell, depending on their station. She had done it to her daughter. She had tried to do it to the cook. No one in that saloon breathed easily. Mr. Price said Augusta was overwrought. Augusta Vale lifted her cane and struck the floor once. The sound cracked through the room. She said she had been overwrought for 4 years and mistaken for dignified. That was when Mr. Price moved. He did not lunge like a villain in a stage melodrama. He stepped backward, quickly, toward the side passage. Perhaps he meant to reach his cabin. Perhaps he meant to throw the false bottle into the sea. Perhaps he meant to find the small revolver gentlemen sometimes carried and never admitted they feared needing. Captain Ames caught his arm. Mr. Price twisted free with surprising force and struck the captain across the face with the heavy handle of Mrs. Vale's dropped cane. The saloon erupted. Miss Cora screamed. Beatrice was pulled back by Mary. Henry moved toward Julian, but his weakened heart and the rolling yacht made him unsteady. Julian seized the carving knife from the sideboard, Eliza's missing knife, planted earlier and waiting there under a napkin, and backed toward the aft passage. He said no one would believe a dead woman's dinner scribbles over a living gentleman's word. Then the lamps flickered. The yacht rolled as a wave struck broadside. The foghorn sounded again. In that half-dark moment, Mr. Price fled down the passage. Captain Ames shouted for the deckhands. Eliza ran too. She did not think of station. She did not think of wages. She thought only of the blue bottle, the open deck, the fog, and Beatrice's face when she said her mother had been trying to come back. The passage was narrow and wet near the aft door. Someone had left it unlatched. Fog poured in. Eliza saw Mr. Price ahead, a dark shape against the white, one hand on the rail, the knife in the other. He was trying to reach the small launch suspended at the stern. If he lowered it in fog, he might vanish or drown. Either way, the proof could vanish with him. Henry was behind her, calling her name. Captain Ames was slower, one hand pressed to his bleeding temple. Julian turned when he heard her. He looked almost astonished that she had followed. He told her to go below where she belonged. Eliza said she had been below. That was where she had heard him. The knife lifted. She saw then that he did not mean to stab her if he could avoid it. Not from mercy, from calculation. A dead cook on deck was trouble. A frightened cook who slipped, struck her head, and fell in fog might be explained. He stepped toward her with that thought in his face. Eliza backed until her shoulder struck the wet rail. Her hand found a coil of line. She seized the loose end and threw it, not at him, but toward the launch davit behind him. The line caught his ankle as the yacht rolled again. It was a clumsy, desperate movement, the kind born from years of kitchen work where hot pans, dropped knives, and falling pots teach the body to act before dignity can object. Julian stumbled. The knife struck the deck and slid. Henry kicked it away. A deckhand crashed into Julian from the side. Another seized his arm. The three men went down hard in the fog and spray. For a moment, Eliza thought it was over. Then Henry gave a sharp cry and dropped to one knee. His hand was at his chest. The false medicine had not touched his lips, but fear and exertion had done their own work. His face had gone the color of candle wax. Captain Ames shouted for air, for blankets, for the real medicine. But the real blue bottle was still missing. Eliza remembered then, not a fact, a smell. When Mr. Price held her apron in the saloon, there had been a faint, bittersweet scent near the hem pocket. Not only from the false bottle, something sharper. Samuel had once made her smell tinctures at the apothecary so she would know laudanum from camphor, digitalis from harmless bitters. The real medicine might have been close to her all evening. She ran back to the saloon and seized her apron from the table. The hem felt heavier than it should. Someone had opened the seam and tucked a small object inside, intending perhaps to make it appear she had stolen the medicine, or perhaps intending to retrieve it later. Eliza tore the seam with her teeth and fingers. The original blue bottle dropped into her palm. Mrs. Vale watched from the chair, her face shattered by understanding. Eliza carried the bottle to Captain Ames. He measured the dose with hands that did not tremble despite the blood on his cheek. Henry took it with water and lay still under blankets while the fog pressed close around them, and Julian Price cursed from where deckhands held him bound. By dawn, the Althea had anchored under escort near Newport. The harbor looked ordinary in morning light. That seemed indecent. Gulls cried, boats moved, men shouted across water. The grand houses stood on shore as if nothing had shifted in the night. But aboard the yacht, no one mistook ordinary light for safety. The harbor police came first, then a doctor, then a local magistrate who looked annoyed at being summoned into a family matter, until he saw the bottles, the cards, the knife, the spoon, Captain Ames's wound, and Mr. Price bound in a cabin with 2 deckhands at the door. Julian Price was taken ashore without his hat. Rich men can survive many humiliations, but in Newport, being seen hatless under guard carried a peculiar brutality. People on the quay stared. Someone recognized him. By afternoon, versions of the story had reached Bellevue Avenue, the reading rooms, the kitchens, and the newspaper office. By evening, every version was wrong in at least 3 ways, but all contained the important fact. Mr. Julian Price had not left the Calder yacht by choice. Henry was carried to his Newport house and put under the doctor's care. Eliza expected to be dismissed then, perhaps paid extra for silence, perhaps thanked in a letter carefully worded by a lawyer. That was how large houses handled inconvenient service. They folded a woman away with wages and hoped gratitude would keep her quiet. Instead, she was told Mrs. Vale wished to see her. Eliza nearly refused. Mary, who had come ashore with the party, said refusal might be satisfying, but curiosity was sometimes worth more. The room where Augusta Vale received her was not large by Newport standards, which meant it could have held Eliza's entire Providence lodging twice over. Windows faced the sea. Madeleine's portrait hung above the mantel, the same portrait from the yacht, brought ashore years earlier and copied for the saloon. Beatrice sat near it, holding the bundle of menu cards tied with faded ribbon. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were clearer than Eliza had yet seen them. Mrs. Vale was standing. That surprised Eliza. The older woman looked as if the night had taken years from her and left truth in their place. Her cane rested beside the chair, unused. She asked Beatrice to remain. Then she said Eliza's full name. Not cook, not girl, not woman. Eliza Merrin. The name sounded unfamiliar in that room, and therefore powerful. Mrs. Vale said she had wronged Eliza publicly and privately. She had allowed old prejudice to serve new fear. She had believed that a servant with notes must be inventing because she did not want to admit her daughter had once written the same way. She had used class to silence the same warning twice. Eliza listened without softening her face. Apologies from powerful people often come wrapped in a request to remove the discomfort that made them necessary. She waited for the request. Mrs. Vale said she did not ask forgiveness. That was better. She said she asked only what Eliza wished done with the truth of Madeleine's cards. Henry wanted them preserved. The magistrate would need copies. Lawyers would argue. Newspapers would pry. Beatrice had a right to know her mother was neither careless nor mad. But public truth could wound a child, even as it freed her. Eliza looked at Beatrice. The girl held the cards carefully, not as scandal, but as letters finally delivered. Eliza said truth should not be hidden from Beatrice in order to make adults comfortable. But truth could be given with tenderness, not thrown like a dish. Mrs. Vale nodded once. Beatrice crossed the room then and placed something in Eliza's hand. It was one of the old menu cards, not the one about the blue bottle, a different one, from the last dinner Madeleine had eaten aboard the Althea. On the printed side were courses no one remembered clearly. On the back, in Madeleine's hand, was a line that had not yet been read aloud. If B grows up, let someone teach her that being believed is a form of love. Eliza felt her throat close. Beatrice said her mother had not come back, but the card had. There was no proper answer to that. Eliza put her arm around the child because propriety had done enough harm already. Beatrice stiffened at first, then leaned in like someone who had been standing too long. Mrs. Vale turned toward the window. She did not pretend not to cry. That, too, was a change. The inquiry lasted weeks. Julian Price's rooms were searched, papers were found hidden behind a false panel in a secretary desk, trust documents, forged authorizations, letters from brokers, and drafts in Madeleine's hand demanding explanations. The false blue bottle contained a dangerous mixture that could have made Henry confused, weak, and easy to guide toward a fall. The old case from 4 years before was reopened as far as pride, law, and decayed evidence allowed. No one could bring Madeleine back to testify, but her menu cards did what the dead sometimes manage through ordinary objects. They refused to disappear. The newspapers were careful at first, then less careful. Newport society pretended to be shocked that a gentleman could behave so, though kitchens and servants' halls repeated the story with less surprise. Mrs. Vale withdrew from calls. Miss Cora Blanchard married a dry goods heir in Philadelphia within the year, and thereafter spoke of the sea as injurious to nerves. Captain Ames kept his command after Henry insisted silence was no longer a qualification for service. Mary Klein received a raise and said she preferred cash to speeches. Eliza returned to Providence after Henry's doctor declared him out of immediate danger. She told herself she wanted ordinary work, ordinary floors, ordinary stoves, doors that opened onto streets instead of water. For 3 days, she cooked at the boarding house where she lodged and answered questions from women who had read fragments in the newspaper. She sent Samuel money and made him promise not to leave his apprenticeship to come fuss over her. She slept badly. Each night she woke hearing the foghorn and reached for menu cards no longer in her apron. On the 4th day, a letter arrived. Not from Henry Calder, though his hand addressed the envelope. Inside were 3 letters, one from Henry, one from Beatrice, and one from Mrs. Vale. Henry's was plain. He wrote that gratitude was too small a word and money too crude a language, though he intended to pay every wage and reward owed. He did not offer patronage disguised as rescue. He wrote instead that the Calder household needed rebuilding in ways no architect could manage. Beatrice trusted Eliza. Mrs. Vale, for reasons that would need time to deserve trust, wished to make amends through action. If Eliza ever wanted a position outside ordinary service, he would fund a kitchen school for working girls in Providence or Newport under her direction, with no requirement that it bear his name. Eliza read that twice. Then she read Beatrice's note. It was short. The letters were careful, the lines uneven. Miss Merrin, Grandmother says I must not beg, so I am writing plainly. I would like to learn how you noticed things. I would like to learn cooking too, not because Grandmother says it is useful for charity, but because Mother wrote on menu cards and you read them. Please come if you wish. If you do not, I will still remember that you believed her. Eliza sat down at the boarding house kitchen table. Mrs. Vale's letter was the longest and the hardest to read. It did not defend. It did not decorate. Augusta Vale wrote that she had spent much of her life confusing refinement with virtue and silence with strength. She wrote that she had loved Madeleine poorly when love required believing uncomfortable things. She wrote that she had treated Eliza as a danger because Eliza's class made her easier to dismiss than Julian's charm. She wrote that if Eliza accepted Henry's proposal for a school, Augusta would endow it in Madeleine's memory and would submit the first public statement herself, naming the menu cards and the woman who preserved them. At the bottom, after the formal signature, was one additional line. I called you impertinent because you saw what I refused to see. Eliza folded the letters and sat in the kitchen until the fire burned low. Samuel arrived that evening, breathless from the train, despite his promise. He said Providence newspapers were useless and he needed to see whether she still had all her limbs and her temper. She fed him stew and showed him the letters. He read Henry's first and said rich men had odd ideas about making offers sound modest. He read Beatrice's and grew quiet. He read Mrs. Vale's and put it down carefully. Then he asked whether Eliza wanted a kitchen school. Eliza said she did not know. Wanting had never been the first question in her life. Need had always arrived earlier and louder. Samuel said perhaps wanting deserved a chair at the table now. It was an irritating thing for a younger brother to say, mostly because it was true. In September, Eliza returned to Newport. Not to the yacht. She refused to set foot on the Althea again until the inquiry ended, and Henry did not press her. Instead, she met him, Beatrice, Mrs. Vale, Mary, and a lawyer in a plain office above a bank. The lawyer brought documents. Eliza brought conditions written on brown paper because fine paper made some men think plain words needed improvement. The school would admit working girls, widows, and servants wishing to improve their wages. It would teach cooking, household management, safe food handling, arithmetic for marketing, reading of labels and medicines used in kitchens, and letter writing. Students would not be trained to bow their way through cruelty. They would be trained to work well, and to know when a household's demand exceeded dignity. The school would keep a fund for girls leaving bad positions. Its finances would be reviewed by a board, including at least 2 women who had worked for wages. Mrs. Vale asked whether Eliza expected ladies to sit on a board with cooks. Eliza said ladies who could not sit with cooks had little to teach a kitchen school. Henry coughed into his hand. Mary smiled openly. Beatrice looked at Eliza as if watching a door open. Mrs. Vale considered. Then she said she would sit. Eliza said sitting was not the same as ruling. Mrs. Vale said she was learning that late, but she was learning. So the Madeleine Calder School of Practical Cookery and Kitchen Management opened in a former seamstress's shop 2 streets back from Newport's fashionable avenues, close enough to hear carriage wheels from grand houses, and far enough that working girls were not ashamed to enter. Eliza insisted on a different public name painted beneath the formal one: the Menu Card School, Practical Lessons for Women Who Work. The sign caused discussion. That suited Eliza. On the first day, 6 students came. 1 was a hotel kitchen girl with burns on both wrists. 1 was a widow who wanted to run a boarding table. 1 was a maid, dismissed after refusing a master's son. 1 was a fisherman's daughter who could clean cod faster than any of them, but could not yet read a recipe. 2 were sisters from a laundry who wanted work that did not leave their hands raw by 30. Eliza began with bread because bread revealed everything: patience, heat, measurement, thrift, and the fact that a woman's hands could turn small ingredients into survival. Beatrice attended twice a week under the pretense of lessons in domestic charity. No one believed the pretense, least of all Beatrice. She learned to make broth, then pastry, then coffee strong enough for dock porters and not too strong for ladies. She also learned to listen when working women spoke. That lesson unsettled her more than chopping onions. Mrs. Vale came every Friday. At first, the students feared her. She still dressed like judgment. She still had a way of looking at crooked tablecloths as if civilization had declined. But she did not correct Eliza in front of them. She did not call them girls when they were women. When one student broke a mixing bowl and burst into tears, Mrs. Vale paid for a new bowl and said with visible effort that porcelain had no soul and need not be mourned. Mary laughed about that for a week. Henry came less often. His health remained uncertain, though improved. He wrote checks, answered legal questions, and spent long afternoons with Beatrice in ordinary companionship he had not known how to claim while grief stood between them like a formal chaperone. Sometimes he walked with Eliza after lessons, discussing the school's needs. He never again thanked her in a way that made gratitude a cage. He learned to ask what she intended rather than what he might give. Their friendship became a quiet, useful thing. People tried to make more of it. People always did. A cook and a rich widower could not stand in the same doorway without society writing a bad novel around them. Mrs. Vale, to her credit, shut down such talk with a severity that made several callers regret tea. Eliza heard rumors and kept working. She had learned that being misunderstood was not fatal. Being silenced could be. The trial of Julian Price began the next spring. By then, Henry was stronger, Beatrice taller, and Mrs. Vale older in a way that had less to do with years than surrendering lies. The courtroom was crowded. Eliza testified about the overheard conversation, the changed menu, the false bottle, the missing apron, the old cards, and the night in the fog. Lawyers tried to make her sound imaginative. One suggested that women in service sometimes mistook kindness from gentlemen for confidence. Eliza answered that women in service learned the difference because their wages depended on it. The old menu cards were admitted as evidence where they could be, disputed where they could not, and read by more people than Madeleine had ever expected when she wrote in fear. The strongest case concerned the attempt on Henry's life, not Madeleine's death. The law, like society, often finds fresh harm easier to see than buried harm. Still, the dead woman's name returned to public speech, stripped of the word delicate.
Julian was convicted for the attempt against Henry and related frauds. The question of Madeleine remained legally clouded, but no one who heard the testimony believed the old story cleanly again. After the verdict, Beatrice asked Eliza whether justice had been done. They stood outside the courthouse under a cold blue sky. Reporters waited near the steps. Mrs. Vale sat in the carriage, exhausted. Henry spoke with the prosecutor. Eliza thought of Madeleine's handwriting, of the rocks below the cove, of the false bottle, of Augusta's silence, of the years Beatrice had been told her mother was too frail to remain in the world. She said some justice arrived with papers, and some only with changed memory. Beatrice said changed memory did not seem enough. Eliza answered that it was not enough, but it was better than a lie with flowers under it. The girl took that in, as she took in most things, seriously. The years that followed did not turn the story into a fairy tale. Henry did not suddenly become well forever. Mrs. Vale did not become soft. Eliza did not forget what it meant to be humiliated in the saloon beneath Madeleine's portrait. Beatrice did not stop missing a mother she could now understand more clearly and therefore grieve more sharply. But life, when given a little truth, found new directions. The menu card school grew. By its third year, it had 20 students each term and a waiting list from Providence, Fall River, New Bedford, and Boston. Some graduates went into better positions. Some opened boarding tables. One became assistant cook at a women's college. Another returned to her fishing town and taught girls to preserve fish safely instead of relying on guesswork and luck. Samuel, now a licensed pharmacist's assistant, came once a month to lecture on household medicines, poison labels, and the danger of trusting bottles by color alone. He began each lecture by holding up a blue bottle. The students always leaned forward. Eliza kept the original menu cards in a locked glass case near the school's entrance. Not all of them. Some belonged to Beatrice and remained private. But 3 were displayed. Henry's first note thanking the cook for remembering, Eliza's note about the changed oysters, and Madeleine's line about being believed as a form of love. Visitors often stood before the case longer than expected. Working women read the cards with a kind of fierce recognition. Ladies read them uneasily. Men read them quickly, then returned when they thought no one watched. Small pieces of paper had a way of making large rooms less comfortable. Mrs. Vale hated the glass case at first. She said it made family grief into an exhibit. Eliza said it made warning visible. Mrs. Vale stayed away for 2 weeks, then returned with a 4th card, framed separately. On it, she had written her own statement. I did not believe my daughter because believing her would have cost me the world I knew. That world was not worth her silence. She asked Eliza to decide whether to display it. Eliza did. It became the card most women stopped before. In 1903, Beatrice turned 17 and refused a season in Newport until she had completed a full term of lessons at the school. Mrs. Vale called this unnecessary. Henry called it admirable. Eliza called it work and gave Beatrice the same examinations as everyone else. Beatrice burned her first custard and cried from fury, not shame. Eliza made her do it again. On the 3rd attempt, it set properly. Beatrice carried it to Mrs. Vale, who tasted it in the front room under the gaze of 6 students pretending not to watch. Mrs. Vale said it was very good. Beatrice asked whether she meant it or only wished to encourage improvement. Mrs. Vale looked at Eliza, who raised one eyebrow. The older woman said the custard was good, and the first 2 had been dreadful. Beatrice laughed. It was the first time Eliza heard Madeleine's portrait become less heavy in the room, though the portrait was not there. Some sounds released the dead more kindly than prayers. That autumn, Captain Ames retired from the Althea.
Henry offered to sell the yacht. For a long time, none of them had wanted to step aboard. The vessel had carried pleasure, lies, terror, and proof. Beatrice said selling it to another family would feel like letting strangers dance in a room where her mother had tried to scream. Eliza suggested a different use. The Althea was refitted as a summer training vessel for girls from the school who wished to work in resort hotels, seaside houses, or ship's galleys. Captain Ames, who had claimed he wanted quiet retirement, agreed to teach safety, weather sense, and the difference between romantic water and working water. Mary Klein became stewardess instructor and ruled linen, cabins, and common sense with equal force.
The first time Eliza boarded again, her hands went cold on the gangway. The harbor was bright. Gulls cried. The yacht's white hull gleamed as before. Yet every step brought back fog. The pantry, the knife, the cards against her apron. Henry on the deck. Julian's voice saying no one would believe a dead woman's dinner scribbles. Beatrice walked beside her. She did not say there was nothing to fear. That would have been foolish and unkind. She said her mother had tried to come back through paper, and now the yacht could carry women forward instead. Eliza looked at the girl, nearly grown, and wondered when children became wise enough to frighten and comfort adults at the same time. They went aboard together. In the saloon, Madeleine's portrait had been replaced by a smaller copy placed in a side alcove, not dominating the room, but not hidden. Beneath it, Beatrice had set a simple brass frame with a new menu card printed for the training vessel's first meal. Cold chicken, brown bread, stewed peaches, coffee, lemon cake. On the back, in Beatrice's hand, was written, "For those who notice." Eliza had to turn away for a moment. Years later, people told the story differently depending on what they needed from it. Some made it a tale about a wicked gentleman exposed by a clever cook. Some made it about a proud grandmother humbled by grief. Some made it about a rich widower saved at sea. Some made it about menu cards, which sounded charming until one understood what had been written on them. Eliza disliked most versions. They smoothed the edges. They made courage sound like a quality a person carries ready-made instead of something grabbed in terror because no one else is reaching. They forgot the money that made her accept the position, the shame Mrs. Vale laid on her in the saloon, the danger of speaking when a servant's word weighed less than a gentleman's glove. They forgot that Madeleine had written first and had not been saved in time. So Eliza wrote her own version, not for newspapers, not for society, for the school. She wrote it in plain language and had copies made for every student who completed the C course. It began with practical instructions. Never serve a dish against a known medical restriction. Label bottles by contents, not color. Keep your own notes. Trust repeated unease more than single fright. Know where exits are. Never let a person of rank make you ashamed of accuracy. At the end, she added the part that mattered most. If you are the only one who notices, that does not mean you are wrong. It may only mean the room has been arranged so that no one hears you. Write it down. Tell someone who can act. If no one listens, keep the proof safe and stay alive long enough to speak again. She signed it, Eliza Merrin, cook and superintendent. Mrs. Vale objected to the word cook in the signature. She said superintendent was sufficient. Eliza said cook was the reason she saw the menu. Mrs. Vale conceded the point with more grace than she would once have shown. In 1908, on a mild June evening, the school held its 10th commencement supper. There were no oysters. Eliza had not forbidden them forever, but everyone knew better than to print them for that occasion. The menu was sensible and excellent. Clear soup, roast chicken, potatoes with parsley, green beans, brown bread, lemon cake, coffee, and stewed peaches, in honor of the first meal Henry had thanked her for aboard the Althea. The room was full. Graduates returned with husbands, sisters, employers, children, and stories of wages raised, kitchens improved, bad positions left, good positions found. Samuel came from Boston with his own apothecary sign painted at last. Captain Ames, older but still formidable, sat beside Mary Klein, who corrected his table manners twice. Henry, greyer and slower, sat near Beatrice, who had become a woman with her mother's eyes and her own steady mouth. Mrs. Vale arrived late. She was very old by then, though she hated anyone noticing. She wore dark blue instead of gray, a concession so dramatic that Mary whispered the sea itself might stop from shock. She walked with a cane she truly needed. When she entered, conversations softened, not from fear, as once, but respect, complicated by memory. After supper, Beatrice rose to speak. She did not speak long. She told the graduates that her mother had once written on the back of menu cards because no one had taught her how to be heard aloud. She told them Eliza had read those cards, believed them, and built a school where working women were trained not only to serve, but to observe, decide, and protect themselves. She said the school's next fund would support girls who wished to study pharmacy, nursing, navigation, or business arithmetic, because kitchens opened onto more of the world than society admitted. Then she asked Mrs. Vale to say a few words. Augusta looked furious for half a second. Then she rose. Eliza watched her grip the chair, gather breath, and face a room filled with women she once would have addressed only through servants. Mrs. Vale said she had no advice except what she had learned too late. She said never to mistake polish for goodness, never to use family pride as a curtain, never to call a woman hysterical because her truth was inconvenient, and never to assume the quiet person in the room had seen less than the one speaking most. Her voice trembled on the last sentence. She did not look at Eliza until she sat. Eliza looked back and inclined her head. That was the form their forgiveness had taken. Not embrace, not forgetting, but a long exchange of truth honored by action. After the guests left and the last cups were washed, Eliza found Beatrice alone near the glass case. The old menu cards had yellowed slightly despite care. Henry's note, Eliza's warnings, Madeleine's plea, Augusta's confession. Small papers, large wreckage, larger repairs. Beatrice said she sometimes hated the cards because they were all she had of her mother's final courage. Eliza said paper could be a poor substitute for arms around you. Beatrice nodded. Then she said she sometimes loved them because they proved her mother had fought to return. Eliza said both could be true. Beatrice opened her reticule and took out a new menu card from that evening's supper. On the back she had written a line and left space beneath it. The line read, "A woman was believed here." Beatrice asked Eliza to sign below it. Eliza thought of the cold pantry and the black-gloved hand with the knife. She thought of the saloon where she had been called ambitious for noticing danger. She thought of Samuel at the train station, Henry's first courtesy, Mary standing guard, Captain Ames bleeding, Mrs. Vale's pride cracking, Madeleine's handwriting, and every student who had since learned to trust her own observations. She signed. Then she handed the pen to Mrs. Vale, who had paused in the doorway. The old woman looked surprised. Eliza said some truths needed more than one witness. Mrs. Vale came forward slowly and signed beneath Eliza's name. Beatrice signed last. They placed the new card in the glass case before turning out the lamps. Outside, Newport lay silver under moonlight, all its grand houses softened by distance. Somewhere in the harbor, the Althea rested at her mooring, no longer merely a vessel of secrets, but a schoolroom for girls who learned the sea as work, not ornament. A bell sounded faintly from a buoy. The air smelled of salt and cooling stone. Eliza locked the school door. For years, she had believed safety meant earning enough, keeping quiet enough, making herself useful enough that no one thought to crush her. The sea had taught her otherwise. Safety built on silence belonged to the first person powerful enough to break it. What saved lives was not quiet. It was attention. Recorded. It was courage. Shared. It was one woman writing on a menu card because no one would hear her speak, and another woman, years later, refusing to close her apron over the truth. As Eliza walked home through the narrow street behind the fashionable avenue, she carried no silver, no inheritance, and no borrowed family name. In her pocket was a blank menu card. She kept it there, always, not because she expected danger at every table, but because the habit had become a promise. If the room changed, if voices lowered, if someone small was about to be blamed for what someone powerful had done, she would not trust memory alone. She would write, and this time, she would be heard.